August 8th, 1980, on a small island called Lopez, located off the coast of Washington State in the San Juan Islands, a gruesome crime took place. According to local officials, there hadn't been a major crime on the island in 50 years. Ruth Neslund shot her husband twice in the head, dragged his body to a tub, and with the help of her brother Robert, chopped him up and burned him in a trash barrel. Ruth Neslund was my great aunt, and Rolf Neslund, my great uncle by marriage. Both my grandpas had passed before I was born, so Rolf was really my only grandfather when I was that age. He was genuinely the sweetest, kindest man who greeted everyone with a smile and a laugh, and everyone that knew him loved him. But before we get into the details of the case, I just wanted to give you a snapshot of the kind of people Ruth and Rolf were fundamentally. Ruth was the kind of person that was always trying to find the next scam, the next paycheck. She even had a prior felony conviction in 1973 for real estate tax evasion. But let's focus on one of her favorites, insurance fraud, for instance. A couple of years before she murdered Rolf, she burned down one of the older buildings on their property on Lopez. She laughed and bragged about how she told the insurance company that the house had been used to store all of the antiques she'd just bought, and now she wanted to collect the money. Meanwhile, the antiques are safe and sound in another storage unit, of course. The insurance company saw no proof of any wreckage, so they did not give her the money. They didn't arrest her either, which is interesting, but honestly, knowing her and how she'd turn on her charm, or she probably just played the role of old forgetful lady, and they obviously let it go. I mean, it was the 70s after all. But that wasn't the reason why she burned down the house. Though if she had gotten away with the money, I'm sure it would have been a perk for her. But no, she burnt it down to break Rolf. Because upstairs, Rolf had made an entire floor dedicated to Christmas. It was his favorite holiday. From decorations to wrapping to ribbons, anything and everything you'd ever need for Christmas. And he also had a box full of 600 addresses of all the friends he'd made over his lifetime from around the world. And every Christmas, he'd send out 600 Christmas cards. And sometimes it would take him until February to send them out. But he loved it. It brought him such joy to connect with hundreds of people he'd met and known over the years. And she burnt it down. This wasn't today where there were backups or home computers or cell phones. None of that. Just 600 written down addresses that were now gone forever with no way of getting them back. And she thought it was funny. And now looking back, she was playing the long game, setting up a scenario where she could convince people that he either died from suicide or that he was so angry she killed him from self-defense. A simple peek into who they were. The man who collects and gives out 600 Christmas cards every year, and the woman who burns it to the ground. This is the true story told through my experiences, but also through the meticulously collected newspaper articles that a family friend saved. And all these years later, when hearing I wrote a fictional book about my experiences with Ruth and Rolf, and told her I was going to do a documentary about the true story, she sent them up to me to help. So basically, this documentary would not be as in-depth as it is without the amazing Gayle. So thank you, Gayle. And along with being chased with a butcher knife, trying to convince me to jump off the cliff because little girls can fly, didn't your mother ever tell you that? To almost being thrown off a 3-story building if Rolf and my father hadn't stopped her. But also, whether you believe in the paranormal or not, I actually dreamt about the murder in full detail. It wasn't until later that my mother realized I had that dream the night it happened. So I am going to tell you everything, give you some insight into both Ruth and Rolf's lives, The events leading up to the murder, which I was actually there and saw some things Ruth didn't want me to see, which somehow in her twisted brain that made my 7-year-old self her target. The murder itself, the aftermath of trying to hide his disappearance, the 700 pieces of evidence found on the property, her arrest, and finally her conviction. A conviction that was before DNA in courts, and since there was no body, it was up to the prosecution to convince the jury of her guilt. 2 years, people. If they had just tried this in 1987 instead of 1985, DNA would have made this case a slam dunk. But because there wasn't a DNA option, they matched the blood type found and it matched Rolf's. But DNA. This was considered an uphill battle for prosecution, even having hundreds of pieces of evidence with Rolf's blood type on it. They even had a strand of hair which matched his hair color and had a fragment of blood and a piece of tissue on it that they found on the trunk that he fell on after he was shot. And they had a piece of Rolf's tissue in the hospital from a prostate operation, so the DNA match would have been so simple if it had been available. Okay, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start at the beginning. Ruth Neslund, aka Ruth Myers, was born in 1920 in the Midwest. She came from a big family, and according to my family that's still alive, it was a very abusive upbringing, allegedly. Which makes sense, though, why she wanted to get out of there as soon as possible, because she married a man at 13. I don't want to dox him because I'm not sure anyone outside the family knows his name. But there might have been a short story published in the early 2000s about Ruth that may have found out his name. But out of respect for him and possibly family that still is alive, I'm not going to say it since it doesn't seem to be public knowledge. But regardless, let's get back to the fact that she was 13. I have no idea how old he was, though. I don't want to automatically assume he was older, but he was old enough to have 2 children with her in 2 years. Some of my family have the suspicion that she was pregnant when she met him, and that's why she wanted to get married before anyone, including him, found out, but that is complete speculation, and Ruth never admitted that to anyone that I know of anyway. But after 2 years of marriage and 2 sons, her husband left with both the boys. In a newspaper article I read, it said that the husband said he was going to get the boys some haircuts, then they never came home. And asking my family about it, they said that the husband left because, I quote, "she was mean to the boys." Okay, this was 1935, so he was probably being polite. But honestly, if Ruth had been raised in an abusive home, she might have just been repeating what she knew. And it was when she was 13 through 15. She was a child. I don't know. Eventually, though, she did reunite with her children, but it's unclear as to exactly when. I did know her oldest, Butch. Yes, his name was Butch. And he was not a pleasant guy. He sold guns in Louisiana, but the family gossip is he illegally sold guns across the border. But the only truth we know for sure is that he sold guns, and he was mean. And his kids' personalities were the inspiration of a spoiled, rotten cousin I wrote in my fictionalized version, A Grandma's Little Secret. And I had a lot to pull from, but I won't dox them because they may actually still be alive. But I hope that they are kinder people as they have aged. Ruth did have a mind for business. She always finding all the loopholes and ways to make legitimate money, but also a lot of scamming the system. But let's face it, she was a survivor. I mean, from what we know about her, she kind of had to be. But before we get into Ruth and Rolf's marriage, let me tell you a bit about Rolf as well. He was born in Norway in 1897. Isn't it crazy when people in our lifetimes were born in the 1800s? It just trips my brain out. At 14, he shipped aboard a brigantine trader ship and served for 6 months before running away. The sea was obviously in his blood because he stowed away on not 1, but 2 ships to America. The first time, they sent him right back home. But the second time, he was able to stay and got his first job in New York painting the high steel beams of a skyscraper. So you know those old photos with men eating lunch on the beams of steel? Like, he was probably one of them. The article I read said the building is at 42nd Street and Madison Avenue. So I Google mapped it and here it is. In this video, though, it looks like they're doing some kind of work on it, but who knows when they took the picture, honestly. But I would love to see it in person. And I am going to a book signing event in New York in February, so I just might have to go check it out. Rolf was in both world wars, and in the First War, his ship was torpedoed by a German sub where 8 of his men died. And in World War II, in 1943, he was captain and commander of a freighter ship, and it was also torpedoed and sank, losing 21 men. He obviously survived, but according to the articles, he saved a lot of men on both ships. After the Second War, he joined the Puget Sound Pilots. And before he was murdered, Rolf was actually very famous for destroying the West Seattle Bridge on June 11th, 1978. He was the pilot and had given orders to hundreds of ships sailing through the Sound. But according to the logs of this particular time, there was a lot of pointing fingers, and ultimately Rolf and the Yugoslavian captain were reprimanded. The captain went back home, and Rolf went into early retirement. I can only go by what Rolf told my dad, which was that it was a very difficult situation and that him, the captain, and the crew were all devastated and just grateful no one got hurt. There are transcripts of what happened, and I'm sure the truth is somewhere in there. There was this piece written in a kind of fictionalized way, but yeah, no, let's just say he didn't capture Rolf's character. He made him like this grumpy old man that like might as well be yelling whippersnapper. And Rolf was just nothing like that. Not just to me and my family, but even with the testimony of his friends. He was just a really upbeat, positive guy. And Ruth tried to paint the picture that this event destroyed him, making him suicidal. She just needed it to fit her narrative for her plan to kill him. But his close friends and fellow pilots, they all had something to say about it. One guy in particular, he said, a quote, "I asked him straight out, 'Rolf, did you or did you not hit the bridge?' He brightened and said, 'Absolutely not. The ship did.'" Which is so Rolf. I mean, like I said, he was just always cracking jokes, but just a good-tempered, great guy. Another of his friends said, "I thought he took it exceedingly well. Those things can happen so quickly in that tight situation like that. I never did see him despondent." And another said, "He didn't let it get to him. Nothing got to him." But Ruth and Rolf got married April 24th, 1961, when Ruth was 41 and Rolf was 64. And according to everyone that knew them, it was a happy marriage. They're both like kids in a way, playful, partied a lot. Rolf absolutely hated finances, and Ruth, of course, loved them. So she took over all of it, and he was thrilled about it. He was a shipping pilot for the Puget Sound, and she did freelance bookkeeping and tax work. And according to an article, Ruth and Rolf's accountant said, quote, "She would do anything for a fee. Buying and selling real estate, insurance. She'd go to neighbors and say she'd sell their homes for them. She'd find a buyer and never take the money, just a contract for her commission. I found close to 200 cards filed of properties she had contracts on. Property-wise, they called her a Sharpie." I mean, she was good at what she did. And honestly, Rolf's friends and coworkers talked about how they remembered when he got really sick one time and couldn't leave the pilot station in Port Angeles, and Ruth came immediately and took care of him. So we know their relationship wasn't always horrible, because there were also claims that the two were violent against each other. This I can't respond to, as no one knows what happens behind closed doors. I mean, I can only speak of one time, which I will get into details later, but I did witness Ruth holding a gun at Rolf while he was about 10 feet away from her, and she kept yelling for him to stop hitting her, and then she proceeded to punch herself, like in her arm, in her legs, in her stomach, all while holding the gun at him. But again, this is something I'll get into later because it is relevant to the murder itself. Actually, you know what? Let's get into it now, okay? Before Ruth murdered Rolf on August 8th, 1980, she decided to have a family reunion at their house on Lopez Island. My family was the only family that lived near them in Seattle, so it was an easy ferry ride for us, my mom, my dad, me, and my sister. But for everyone else, they all lived in Ohio, so it was a big caravan of aunts and uncles, their adult kids, which were my cousins, and their kids were my second cousins, but they were my age. The giant age gap comes from my grandma having her first child at 15 and then having my mom at 40. So big age gaps. Basically, my mom grew up with her nieces and nephews being around her age, some older and some younger. But the reunion started out great. Clam digging, boat rowing, playing on the beach. But then my parents had to leave for my dad's work. So my sister and I stayed with the rest of the family. And that second night, my sister and I shared a room and we heard arguing. I, of course, wanted to check it out while my sister wanted me to go back to bed and ignore it. But once I recognized the voices as being Ruth and Rolf's, my protective instincts kicked in for Rolf because, like I said, he was my grandpa and I would do anything for him. So I went to check it out. Their door was slightly cracked open and I looked inside. As a kid, of course, I had no real idea what I was looking at, but it was exactly as I just described. He was 10 feet away, she was pointing a gun at him, and she was yelling at him to stop hitting her while she was hitting herself. Honestly, he was just sitting there with his hands up and trying to calm her down. But in the middle, I caught her eye in the doorway like a movie. And if looks could kill, it scared me so much. I just turned and ran. And I ran into the first door I could find, which happened to be my aunt and uncle's. I asked if I could sleep with them, but my aunt said that my uncle had a bad back, so they needed the bed, but I did not care at all. I just didn't want to go out into the hallway where I was positive Ruth was probably just sitting there waiting for me, which, probably wasn't true, but it felt true at 7 years old. So I just curled up in the corner on the floor and went to sleep. And the next morning, apparently, everyone, and I mean everyone except Ruth, went to the grocery store because I used to sleep like the dead. I mean, you could not wake me up when I was a kid. And so apparently they tried to wake me up and it didn't work. So they just decided to let me sleep and let Ruth watch me. So I was alone in the house with Ruth. Okay, and I don't know if any of you believe in guardian angels, but my imaginary friend, her name was Fish Lady. I know, very creative, but she had seaweed all over her, so it made sense in my little 7-year-old brain. But she woke me up and told me to hide in the abandoned doghouse at the back of the property, and I did. The room that I was in had a sliding glass door, so I opened it and I just walked back to the doghouse and went inside. Didn't question it. And a few minutes later, I heard the slurred, very drunk words of Ruth telling me, quote, "Didn't your mother ever tell you not to play with knives?" And then I heard the shunk of the sliding glass door, and through the opening of the doghouse door, I could see her legs. And at her side was a butcher knife. Oh, I wasn't even allowed to see horror movies when I was a kid, so I had no basis of comparison. I was terrified. She kept calling for me to come out, and then she just stopped. And then I swear to God, she just did one of these. Lean down until our eyes met. Oh my God. In that moment, though, the phone rang, which was my mother, by the way, with her spidey sense screaming at her that her daughter was in trouble. And then the RV pulled up from the grocery store at that exact moment. So thank God, Ruth left and went back inside. And when she picked up the phone, all my mother said was, "Put Becca on the phone right now." But needless to say, I did not tell anyone what happened. Not the gun, not the punching, not the knife. So they all thought I was homesick, which, to be fair, I was the kid that always got homesick. And when my aunt saw my face coming back in from the doghouse, she honestly just thought I was going to worry my mother. So she bribed me with a new bike to tell her everything was fine, which no self-respecting 80s child would say no to a bike. But my mom didn't buy it and pretty much threatened to get on the ferry and come and pick up me and my sister immediately. But before we got on the ferry, Ruth apparently now saw me as a witness, and she wanted to try one more time before we left to get rid of me, I'm assuming, because we stood on the cliff, because I'm not making this up. Their house was on a cliff. I know, it's such a movie. But yes, it was on a cliff, and I was there by myself, and my sister and some family members and aunts and uncles were down by the beach, and Ruth came up to me and she starts telling me that little girls can fly. And didn't your mother ever tell you? I can't believe she never told you that. Oh, I'm gonna have a talk with her. She should let you know. Yeah. So she wanted me to jump. Luckily, I don't know, again, universe, guardian angels, but I just turned around and left. Yeah, and I guess I'm really lucky she didn't push me. We all got on the ferry because we were moving the reunion to our house. And as soon as we got to our house, I hid in a purple blanket in the closet. And she, of course, searched me out. She found me, pretended she'd found the one-eyed, one-horned, flying purple people eater, walked to our 3-story deck and started swinging. Like, 1, 2, 3, and I screamed so loud. Rolf and my dad immediately grabbed the blanket, and I got out of it and I ran under the dining room table, and I stayed there for the whole rest of the day until everyone left. Pretty much everyone was gone, but Rolf was the last to go, and he kneeled down so he could see me under the table, and he gave me a scuff to the head and told me he loved me. And that was the last time I ever saw him alive. So from what I witnessed that night, we're now sure she had planned to kill him at the reunion and make everyone think it was self-defense. I mean, everyone noticed the bruises the next day, but no one said anything back then. And even though the obvious reason would be that Rolf hurt her, you know what? No one believed it. And I knew from my own eyes that she'd given herself those bruises. And had she done this before? I mean, did my aunts and uncles know about it, but just chose to ignore it? I honestly don't know. But I do know what I saw. And shortly after, even Ruth and Rolf went on a road trip to Ohio, where we're pretty sure she was going to try it again. She kept picking fights with Rolf, according to, the relatives that spent time with them. But Rolf didn't really take the bait, and it never escalated to a level Ruth was probably satisfied with, because obviously Rolf made it home alive. But I think the final push for Ruth was when Rolf found out that she drained their mutual accounts when he tried to cash a check and couldn't. I mean, she'd been preparing for his murder, and she wanted to make sure she had all the cash safe and sound before she did it. I don't think she was expecting him to find out so quickly, though, because on August 8th, 1980, Rolf confronted Ruth about the accounts and money, and she shot him twice in the head. Her brother Robert was there, and based on everything that happened to him after, I truly believe this broke him entirely. There's a reason he was never charged as an accessory and wasn't even brought in to testify. After dragging his sister's husband into the bathroom and dismembering him over the course of the entire day, then burning him, he never recovered. When he returned back to the Midwest, my cousin found him wandering the train tracks, mind completely gone. She took him to a home where he stayed until he passed away. They said he had dementia, which could be true, but I don't know. I just don't believe it. I think he wanted to protect his sister, but his brain couldn't come to terms with what he'd done. I mean, it's saying something when neither the defense nor the prosecution want a key witness to testify. Now, this all took a while before it came to trial, years, though there were people screaming from the rooftops that they knew something nefarious had happened. But let's just start with the 3 major witnesses she confessed to and how their stories match up. First, she called my aunt. It was 9:05 a.m. Pacific time and 12:05 Eastern. My aunt owned a restaurant, and it was a lunch rush. But Ruth's call was fast and to the point. According to my aunt, she said, quote, "Uncle Bob held him and I shot him and he's now outside burning in a barrel." My aunt called Ruth later in the day, and Ruth said it was all true. Like, she doubled down. The story didn't change at all. And my aunt kept calling, hoping Ruth had made it up and hoping Rolf would answer. And then that's when when she called my mom and kind of brought her in. Even though my mom wasn't a major witness, she did testify to trying to talk to Rolf after August 8th. I mean, she also wanted to do this because of my bad dream and wanted me to just see Rolf and talk to Rolf just to calm her daughter down. So my mom even invited Ruth and Rolf to my sister's birthday party, which is the beginning of September, trying anything to make sure that Rolf was okay. And Ruth actually said yes, which made her completely relieved. But then, of course, right before the party, Ruth called and said that her and Rolf had been fighting, they're going to get a divorce, and that Rolf had gone to Norway. And when Ruth made the mistake of going to a Pilots Association reception in January of 1981, she told Rolf's good friend, Captain Gunnar Alsberg, that Rolf would be home from Norway any day now, but then she told his wife that Rolf was up in heaven. Alsberg immediately went to the sheriff's department and reported him missing. So when my mom found out about this, that's when she and my aunt decided to go to the police. And in April of 1981, my aunt gave her official statement at her local sheriff's office in Ohio, and they contacted the San Juan County Sheriff's Office that was investigating Rolf's disappearance. So my aunt and mom testified that after Rolf's retirement, they argued more and Ruth drank more. My mom also told them that in the fall of 1979, Ruth called her up and said she had a fight with Rolf and that, quote, she was going to shoot him. Ruth called my aunt another time and said she was staring at Rolf, who was at a swimming pool, and said, quote, I could shoot him from right here. So, I mean, hello, she had been planning this for years. There's no doubt. I don't know why no one took her seriously. Because honestly, you just would never want to think that someone would do something like that, especially to someone like Rolf, who was just like the epitome of a good person. And on a side note, once this was going to trial, Ruth also called my mom and said to her that she was going to send her 30 pieces of silver, basically comparing her to Judas. Ugh, yeah. No one, not one single family member was on Ruth's side. We all knew she did it. We all saw who she really was. But again, no one ever thought she would go that far. It's just unimaginable. But the second major witness was Winnie Stafford, Ruth's neighbor and close friend. She called her the night after she killed him. So technically, if she killed him in the morning, it was that night. And she asked her to come over. And Winnie arrived in the evening. And just so you know, Winnie first testified several years before, like when they first found him missing, that nothing happened. And when they asked her why she changed her testimony, she said, quote, I felt what had been done, and I was protecting Ruth. But during the trial, she came back to tell the truth. She was the shocking surprise witness. She said she sat with Ruth at the bar in their house while Ruth told her everything, then casually mentioned that Robert was in the bathroom cutting Rolf into pieces. Can you imagine that? I don't even know what I'd do. I would freaking run. I would run. Oh my God. Just so you know, any of my good friends out there, if that ever happens to me, I would run and I would go to the police. And the third major witness was Paul Myers, Ruth's brother. In December 1980, only a few months after Ruth killed Rolf, she flew to California to see her brother Paul, who she hadn't seen or talked to in 20 years. And then she asked him to come up to Lopez to join her and Robert for Christmas. I honestly think she went to him because she needed her brother. I have to think it being December and Christmas being Rolf's favorite and how he loved to celebrate, that I just think it hit her what she'd done, and she just couldn't be alone at Christmas. I think she needed comfort from someone who she thought she could trust. And when he got there, he reunited with Robert, who he hadn't seen since 1948. Obviously, they had some estrangement in that family. But when he got there, that's when both Ruth and Robert told Paul everything. I mean, and they told him everything, where it happened, here, like all the details. Everything from hitting the head on the trunk to, the blood splatter, everything. And then after admitting to dismembering him and using both a broadaxe and a butcher knife. Robert told him that they burned his remains in a trash barrel and dumped it in a manure pile at the house. And one thing, though, that the judge wouldn't let Robert testify about in court, which is kind of weird to me, was the fact that there was a Reader's Digest article Paul said he was reading at Ruth's while he was there. And that article was about how a killer was caught. And when Paul kind of asked her about it, she basically said, quote, she didn't want to make any of the same mistakes. The judge thought it too trivial to allow, but I'm sorry. If I was on the jury and knew that the woman on trial had a Reader's Digest article of basically how to get away with murder and then kind of admitted it to her brother that she'd followed it carefully, I don't think that's trivial, but it doesn't matter. She was convicted, so I guess it doesn't matter in the end. Yeah, there were 2 searches of the house. The first one early on, after it was clear that Rolf was missing and he hadn't gone to Norway or anywhere else. A search warrant was given for the Neslund property. This was on April 13th, 1981. So a man named Don Phillips conducted the first search and was working for the Washington State Crime Lab. He checked the walls and ceiling for bullet holes and tested some reddish-brown stains on the floor and the office, kitchen, everywhere. But he said he found no blood. It was quick, though, not very thorough. Let's just say he didn't go very deep, which I'm sure Ruth was thrilled about. Okay, but now enter Paul, a year later, March 1982. And I have to think that when he actually sat down and thought about his sister and brother and everything that they told him, plus hearing that my mom and aunt had come forward, I don't know. I think he finally just realized that he hadn't seen his sister in 20 years and he hadn't seen his brother in 30 or 40 years. And whether it was self-preservation, worried he might somehow get lumped into potential charges, or just wanting to do the right thing. Either way, Paul came forward and was able to tell the police exactly where to look since the first search 2 years before had turned up nothing. And after a 9-day search, they found over 700 pieces of evidence. A lot of blood spatter, hair, and tissue. Also something to note, Richard and Jean Plummer, who operated a small butcher shop on Lopez Island, they turned over a commercial meat grinder. And quote, we bought it from Mrs. Neslund in July of 1981 for $450. Now, Ruth sold this to them a year after she killed Rolf. So is it possible she used the grinder to help break up the bone so it would burn easier in the trash barrel? Yes. It is a commercial grinder and capable of grinding hard bone, but unfortunately after a year of being used, there's no way to differentiate animal blood from human blood, even if there was a tiny bit left. But I think the Plumbers were very smart in turning it over because you never know. Ruth lost it when the search kept going and going and going, and I can imagine as she watched them taking out pieces of concrete, carpet, ceiling, walls, exactly where she killed him. On that piece of hair with tissue on it on the trunk. But it was enough. They found the 700 pieces of evidence and they were sent to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory in Seattle, where enough blood was found to prove that there had once been a body there. This is the thing though, Ruth's quotes in the newspaper even after this is that she literally said, quote, he told me he was going to Norway and then he was gone. And now I don't know. I just don't know. He has gone away for extended periods, but this is the longest. The bridge wasn't hurt half as bad as Rolf was. I witnessed his suffering. But do I feel he'll come back? I know what people are saying. But you wait. We'll see what they have to say the day Rolf Neslund drives up the driveway and says he's home again. Lies, lies, lies. And part of me thinks she believes the lie. Pathological liars usually do, which is honestly what makes them so convincing. But knowing her history of being a liar, a cheat, a scammer, I guess that's why all of us, the family that knew her, we just knew. So the state's first charge, Tuesday, March 8th, 1983, Senior Assistant Attorney General Greg Canova, along with the San Juan County Police Prosecutor Charles Silverman, charged Ruth with first-degree murder by shooting her husband, Rolf Neslund. Ruth pled not guilty and was released on a $50,000 property bond and returned home in a private airplane with her attorney and neighbor, Fred Whedon. Excuse me? Private plane? Can we talk about Fred Whedon for a second? Okay, this is weirdly extra personal for me because years later, while I was sitting in 9th grade French class, my teacher brought up Ruth's trial. My whole body froze and I started shaking. My teeth started chattering. Only my best friend noticed because obviously she knew everything. And she tried to get the teacher to change the subject, but it turns out Fred Whedon was his best friend. And therefore, my teacher believed Ruth to be innocent. So I had to sit through an entire class listening to a teacher try to convince all of my friends and peers that my great aunt was innocent. Honestly, I nearly threw up afterwards. But thank God for good friends. Deidre, shout out to you for making me laugh, comparing my life to our favorite soap opera at the time, Days of Our Lives. It really, really helped. But back to Ruth and her history of cheating and scamming. After the arraignment, Ruth was clever and she did everything she could to stall the trial and the inevitable. So her first round of stalling was suing San Juan County authorities and officials of the state attorney general's office for $850,000 in damages for illegally searching her house. Ruth claims the search warrants were illegal. She claims they were illegal due to the Supreme Court's exclusionary rule that prohibits the fruits of illegal searches from being used against defendants at criminal trials. And since the warrants were issued by San Juan County Superior Judge Richard Pitt, who was already acting as an inquiry judge in Ralph's disappearance, Ruth said, noting that Pitt had issued similar search warrants 11 months earlier. So basically, state law prohibits an inquiry judge from participating in any subsequent court proceedings. Anyway, it's all the fine detail. I'm sure her lawyer helped her out with this, but they were just trying to find the loophole that would basically make them have to throw out all 700 pieces of evidence for the trial. So even after the state and county decided in March 1983 that they had enough evidence to indict Ruth, prosecutors had to face a 20-month delay while the defense attacked on key search warrants that went all the way to the Washington State Supreme Court. But thank goodness it all came to naught because the Supreme Court deemed the search warrants legal and all the evidence found could be used in the trial. But she did get 20 months out of it. And just so you know, she didn't just file one lawsuit, she filed 3. Like I said, always out for a buck, even when she's on trial for murder. 1 is the one I mentioned for the property damage for during the search. 2 was to get Rolf's retirement benefits. She kills him, but still wants his retirement checks, and she wants the back pay for every month they missed when they reported him missing. And 3, over the estate. Rolf's sons rightfully wanted their father's assets and didn't want the woman who killed him to have power of attorney. Seems pretty reasonable to me. But the judge sided with Ruth on that one. Yeah. So the trial was about to start. There were 150 possible witnesses, but it was so big and complicated, San Juan County decided it couldn't handle it alone. So in April of 1982, it became the first to take advantage of a 1981 state law allowing small counties to ask for help from the state. And as a result, Assistant Attorney General Greg Canova became the lead prosecutor. And also an investigator from his office worked on preparing the case. But there were 400 potential jurors with a 14-page questionnaire. One question asking if they know or have any family members that are on the 150 possible witness list. This is a small island, so that was an actual concern. Oh, but wait! The trial needs to be postponed because Ruth fell and needs hip surgery. Do I think this was intentional? Yes. Yes, I do. She'd been stalling this thing for years at this point with lawsuits and appeals. I mean, she was desperate. Maybe even hoping it would be enough to hospitalize her as opposed to put her in jail. I don't know. But she definitely did not want to go to trial because she absolutely knew she did it. And she knew the 700 pieces of evidence would be enough to convict her. But 7 months later, we're back. And it's back to jury selection. Kind of mentioned them before, but here are the 4 players. For Ruth's defense, we have have Fred Whedon and Ellsworth Connolly. And for the prosecution, we have Assistant Attorney General Greg Canova and Deputy Prosecutor Charles Silverman. Now, jury selection, seriously, it could be a movie of its own. With the judge having to chastise the jury for watching the news and reading articles about the case when they were instructed not to, as every jury is instructed not to. But also, Fred Whedon and Greg Canova were actual experts on the art of jury selection. And they actually went around the state to teach other fellow lawyers how to better do jury selection. So them going head to head on Ruth's trial, I can only imagine it would just be a nightmare. Because the interviews with each juror was taking an average of 20 to 30 minutes for each side. And remember when I said there were 400 potential jurors? Honestly, I don't know. I can only imagine how Whedon and Canova would constantly be like one-upping each other and trying not to let the other one get something on them. But as far as the jurors, but hearing about the trial beforehand, I mean, it potentially could work in either one of their favors because some heavily leaned on Ruth being a victim and then the other leaned on her being a monster. So I can only imagine when they were interviewing them how hard it would be to figure out which way each juror leaned. I mean, it's got to be hard, so. Oh, but hold on, wait. Shocking news. The trial was postponed because Ruth got a nosebleed so bad she had to be flown off the island. Did she cause the nosebleed? Who knows? Probably. Either way, I'm sure she was happy about it. But finally, the trial starts. I've already gone over the testimony of the three main witnesses who she confessed to, but the defense had friends of Ruth's come forward to testify that they also believed Rolf was depressed. But then the prosecution would have Rolf's friends testify that it was the opposite and he was in good spirits. Rolf's ex-wife testified that 3 days before Rolf's disappearance that she should insist on an autopsy if Rolf ended up dead. And she said, "I thought he was afraid that somebody would poison him." So he definitely knew something was up. I just wish he had ran. I honestly don't know why he stayed. I know I said that before, but I don't. I mean, it's just sad because he obviously loved her. Rolf! Ugh. Okay, the defense also had a witness who said Ruth bought the gun that the prosecution claimed was the murder weapon after August 8th. But, I mean, the guy worked with Butch, her son, in Louisiana. So, let's face it, he said whatever Butch told him to say. Because even Butch testified claiming that Ruth also called him on the day of the murder, but she told him that her and Rolf got into a fight and Rolf left her. You know what I'm saying? Okay, I'll give it to Butch to try and protect his mom, but I guarantee she absolutely called him, but she told him the truth, like she did to my aunt and she did to Paul. Their handyman was next, saying he saw Rolf on a ferry to Anacortes 2 days after Ruth killed him. He probably thought Ruth killed him in self-defense, and someone had to drive Rolf's car to Anacortes, where authorities found it abandoned in the ferry parking lot. So my bet is the handyman did it for Ruth. Yeah, she got him convinced. And their contractor also testified that according to Rolf, he'd cut his hand on a table saw 3 months before and needed stitches. But I'm thinking, I don't know, Ruth swung at him with a knife and he cut it, blocking her swing. Okay, maybe I'm speaking from a triggered space of her coming after me with a knife. But honestly, I wouldn't be surprised. And then, of course, Ruth went on the stand, denying she called anyone, said my mother wasn't a real Christian. And when confronted on her saying that Rolf was in heaven to Alsborg's wife, she said, quote, "Never in my wildest stretch of imagination would I visualize Ruth Neslund being in God's heaven." And I hate her. I hate her in this moment. She created this narrative to herself and to others that Rolf was a bad man, and if that was proven that she'd murdered him, she'd need people to believe it was self-defense. She was just sick. She also tried to say that the blood they found was from her bloody noses. So was she just walking around the house letting the blood flow freely out of her nose? Who needs tissues? The fact that her lawyer let her say something so ridiculous, I don't know, it's mind-boggling. Because you know what? It's good to note that not one single family member doubted for a second that she killed him. Let that sink in. But here are the discrepancies that the defense argued. The defense says the timeline of witnesses was off. If Ruth called my aunt at 9 a.m. and confessed to Rolf being burned in a barrel, then how could Robert still be chopping his body when Winnie came over in the evening? Also, if he chopped him up, why weren't there any marks or scuffs on the tub? And can a trash barrel get hot enough to incinerate bone? Okay, here is my theory on the timeline and how it matches up. My theory is that he was killed in the early morning hours, and Ruth called Joy several hours after that. When Winnie came over later that night, I think Bob was still in the bathroom. I don't believe they had just committed the crime, since Winnie didn't walk into a house full of blood on the floor and walls, and as the evidence has proven was there. I think Ruth and Robert cleaned all day. He was disposing of the body, probably for hours, which would explain no axe marks on the tub. Plus, Paul's testimony said they also used a butcher knife. That wouldn't leave marks as well if they were being careful and slow. And I have to bring up the meat grinder again. There's just no way to know if they didn't use it or not. Since according to testimony, bone is very difficult to burn to ash in a trash barrel, Robert could have been in the bathroom putting the pieces of his body in that grinder and then putting him in the barrel. It was a commercial grinder, very capable of grinding bone, and it would explain how the bone would be incinerated. But at this point, it was up to the jury, and it took longer than expected. At 4 days, there were 9 women and 3 men. They had 4 choices: first-degree murder, which is premeditated; second-degree murder, which is not premeditated; first-degree manslaughter, or not guilty. And what ended up being the smoking gun for one of the jurors, because they pretty much were all saying guilty, but one juror was holding out. And then this one juror actually found this, that not even the prosecution pushed, but it came in the form of a newspaper ad. It was published before the date Ruth said Rolf left the country for a visit. The ad was placed August 13th, 1980, and she testified that Rolf left August 14th, 1980. The juror pointed out, if in fact Rolf left and she was expecting him to come back, what was he going to come back to? And later it came out that the neighbor had posted it. Anyway, it ended up kind of not being a smoking gun, but honestly, if it convinced that last juror, I'm grateful for it. Because like I said, if DNA had been involved, this would have been slam dunk. Monday, December 16th, 1985, Ruth Neslund was found guilty of first-degree murder. Some people in the room, and even one jury member, actually cried when the verdict was read. Supposedly, it was because of the extreme verdict of first-degree murder. A lot of people believe she killed him, but again, she convinced them it was self-defense. But can you imagine if I'd told my parents anything that happened at that family reunion? I'd probably have to take the stand. So a 10-year-old telling the jury about when she was 7 and how she saw her great aunt pointing a gun at her husband and punching herself, then came after me drunk with a butcher knife. I don't know. I feel like the jury members wouldn't have been crying then. And they would have known without a doubt that it was premeditated. Several times premeditated. Pick one, honestly. If one of those jurors who had doubts ever sees this video, you can rest now. She did it. And she'd been planning to do it in different ways for quite a while. You just saw the one that worked in the end. But a month later, on January 25th, 1986, Ruth walked out of Island County Jail on a $150,000 bond pending appeal. 8 of her neighbors offered their property for the bond. After their properties were researched for the values and liens, deeds of trust were filed in the San Juan County Superior Court. Of course, her attorney, Fred Whedon, was thrilled and saying how excited she was because, yeah, she may have been convicted of murder, but she gets to go home. But that's how much charm she had. Convincing these poor neighbors to put up their houses to get her out of jail, and some of them probably believed she did it. But seeing the bruises over the years, I mean, again, self-defense. I mean, I physically saw her punching herself. Even though I was a kid and kind of didn't know what was going on then, now I know with certainty, even if it was just that one situation, Rolf did not hurt her. But others just saw the bruises. So, I mean, I can't really blame them for thinking that way. And she, of course, made sure they believed that narrative. Oh, and did anyone count the bruises and injuries on Rolf? Not in the 70s and 80s. When a man says he hurts himself on a saw, they believed him. I mean, it would be difficult for most people back then to believe he was being physically abused by his 60-something-year-old wife. I mean, it's just the way it is. I mean, it probably honestly would be the same today. And when she got home, she wanted to reopen the bed and breakfast. Oh, did I mention her and Rolf had been renting out rooms in their house as a bed and breakfast? Oops. Thank goodness she didn't end up doing that. But nowadays, with social media and YouTube and haunted locations, and not just haunted locations, but hey, I spent the night at an axe murderer's house and she was in it. I mean, how sensationalized would that be now? But no, even though she was convicted of first-degree murder, they still were going to allow her to reopen her bed and breakfast. But staying at home didn't last long, because even though she was court-ordered not to drink, she did it anyway. And she drove home from the store and hit 2 bicyclists on the road, sending them to the hospital. They're okay. She did not kill them, thank God. But she was sent to jail after that, and she stayed there for the remainder of her life, where she died at the age of 73 of a blood clot in 1993. Okay, is this documentary slightly biased? I mean, yes. I don't think there was any way of getting around that. What happened to me personally as a child with Ruth are core, terrifying memories. I mean, she was a monster to me, and she tried to kill me 3 times. But I'm also a writer, and finding empathy for the bad guys is kind of what writers do. So I did try to step back a bit and see the bigger picture, to hopefully give you a more well-rounded picture of who she was. But when you boil it down, the choices she made, no matter what happened in her life to bring her there, were her choices. She made them. She chose to chase a 7-year-old child with a butcher knife. She chose to shoot her husband. She chose to drag him into a tub. She chose to chop up his body with her brother. And she chose to burn him in a barrel. Oh, this was a lot. I'm not gonna lie. Going through these articles and remembering this time in my life, I cried a lot. Obviously, some parts still trigger me, but it was also very freeing, very therapeutic. It was one of the reasons why I wrote my book, Grandma's Little Secret. I mean, it's a fictionalized version of what happened to me personally with Ruth. The characters Virginia and Roy are based on Ruth and Rolf, and I made them my grandparents. One, for a bit of distance for me, so I could tell a story as opposed to sticking to the facts, which weirdly doesn't have a complete beginning, middle, and end. True stories rarely do. It's usually a cluster of events that no matter how hard you try to string it into a completed story, it just doesn't quite fit. But fictionalizing it, giving it a satisfying ending, giving some remorse, some redemption, some arcs, that makes a much better story, and requires injecting it with a little bit of fiction. But I also made them my grandparents for the reader to make it feel like a deeper connection, because it's a lot more intense when the murderer is your own grandmother. Oh, and I also made her a serial killer. She was not a serial killer, but honestly, I would not be surprised. But this book comes out February 17th, 2026, and it is available for pre-order now. So if you would like more insight into 7-year-old me and how I dealt with all of this, although in the book, the main character is 11, because I thought it would be a little too hard for people to imagine a 7-year-old going through that. But I also brought out all the supernatural elements to give it more of a thriller horror spin. And of course, there's my best friends growing up who help the main character with bikes. You know, it's got to have bikes, even on the inside cover. The Schwinn Fair Lady in cherry pink, for those of you who remember. This book is very Goonies meets Stranger Things meets Psycho. So if that's your thing, you should check it out. And if you're still here, thank you for listening to my mini documentary about my great aunt. But I want to end this focusing on Rolf, one of the kindest men I ever knew. Even talking to my family while writing my book and making this documentary, no one ever had a single bad thing to say about him. He was full of charm and laughter and love. He is still missed to this day. For a man to survive 2 world wars, 2 sinking ships, He lived a full life, and for it to end in the way it did will forever be heartbreaking. Thank you, Rolf, for being my grandpa. And I love you.